Okay, so I've got to make this tool. This is a upper control arm spreader tool number J3957. And so here's the components that I made to create this tool. This is cut out of a piece of 1/2-inch steel plate. I just cut it out and shaped it with my grinding wheel. I threaded the hole, cut the notch in here to help it grip the control arm like the original tool shows. This right here is a 1/2 by 20 threaded rod. When you turn a coupling on a 1/2 by 20 threaded rod 2 flats, you are moving it 15/1000ths of an inch, which is what's required. These 2 couplings here I'll weld together, and I'll drill out all but the last 1/2 inch of threads. The last 1/2 inch of threads I'll thread this piece of rod into, and then thread this foot onto the piece of rod. I'm also going to weld, at least tack weld each end. And by drilling out these 2 couplings, it will allow the 1/2 inch rod, the threaded rod, to move in and out. And this is your adjustment right here. This is where you'll make your adjustment. Alright, so here it is together. 1/2 inch steel plate, 1/2 by 20 threaded rod coupling. These 2 welded together and drilled out so that the threaded rod just slides freely there. And this will be your adjustment. Pushing the 2 feet apart. Got the notches right there that hook into the upper control arm, the lip, the flange right there, so that it doesn't slip off. And this will allow me to spread this open 15/1000ths of an inch while I torque down the second bushing. Okay, so the supports are interchangeable from left to right, but I left the old bushings in with the hex facing the rear of the car just for reference, so I can put it back together the way it's supposed to be, the way they came out. The old bushing, and the new bushing. Just going to put a little grease on it. It actually screws in really easy. I thought that these were supposed to cut their way in. I hope that's not a sign that this support is worn out. Hopefully I'm going to get this bushing to torque down. See how loose it is? I don't know if you can see that, but it's loose. I didn't think it was supposed to be like that. But hopefully I'll be able to get these things to torque down to 200 pounds without stripping anything. And another issue I'm going to have is my torque wrench only goes up to 150 pounds, so I'm going to have to borrow one or do something else about that. Alright, that's 150 pounds right there. But I gotta still go up another 50 pounds. Just making sure I don't have any POR 15 on this inside bore so that the eccentric can rotate real easy without binding up. The new grease seals come stuck together. You have to pry them apart. And it's a threaded pin coming out of the eccentric bushing. Now, on my car, when I took them apart, they had the hex of the eccentric bushing facing the rear of the car along with the bottom bushing. But in the book it shows the bottom bushing the hex on the bottom bushing faces the rear of the car, and it shows the hex of the eccentric facing the front of the car. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back together like the books, like the illustration in the book shows. And hopefully I'm not making a mistake, because I'll be straight up and tell you I'm not sure. I just don't know, but I'm just going to go by the book, the illustration in the book. Alright, and now the squeeze bolt goes in here. Alright, I put a little more grease in there because it should be loaded up with grease. It still binds a little, but I guess that it shouldn't be too easy to turn. The fact that I'm putting the hex head on the eccentric bushing facing the front of the car shouldn't matter, shouldn't affect the ride, shouldn't affect the steering geometry. The only thing it'll affect will be the adjustability of the caster and camber, which are done right here. I actually think it'll make it a little easier on the person making the adjustment, because if I put the hex in the back, the way it came off the car, the steering linkage is sort of in the way, so I think this will make it more accessible to whoever's trying to adjust the front end. So now I just put the squeeze bolt in to hold it in there. Seems a little hard to get started because they don't quite line up. I think you need to actually squeeze them a little bit to get this side to line up with this side. So that's it for now. No sense in tightening it all the way down. Doesn't really matter at this point yet. Right, so the best way to do this, take the bushings all the way off. Take the grease boots off. Go ahead and push the grease boots all the way onto the shaft as far as they'll go on both sides. They'll go all the way up over the shoulder. That way they're out of the way enough. You can go ahead and put some grease on the threads here. Coat it real good. Do both sides. Alright, set that aside. Go ahead and put a little bit of grease on the threads inside the control arm so that the bushing will thread in without galling the threads. Put a little bit of grease on the bushing threads. Just start one side. I'm going to go ahead and grease these threads, but I'm not going to put this side in yet, because you want to torque down one side first. All right, so I'm going to go outside and torque this down to 150 foot-pounds. All right, so I got the one side torqued down. Yeah, both ends are greased. A little bit of grease inside the control arm. The rubber boot kind of keeps you from being able to push the shaft all the way into the control arm, but you just have to compress that rubber boot a little bit. I'm going to just start this bushing. It'll thread onto the control arm shaft, and then it will engage the control arm itself. You want to be careful here and make sure that this threads in fairly easy. Now I'm going to back off on it a little bit. Make sure it's not binding up. Put the spreader tool on it. Make sure the spreader tool is square, hand tight. $27.55. So I'm going to add 15 thousandths to that. I want to see 29.05. Gonna move it 2 flats. Whoop. Well, let's try it the right way. $27.55 again. 2 flats. Looking for 29.05. I've got 30.05, so I'm a little too far apart. Looking for 29.05. I got 29.60. I'm gonna let that do it, and I'm gonna go outside and torque this down to 150 foot-pounds. All right, so I got the bushings torqued down to 150 foot-pounds. The shaft is tight. I don't like it. I don't think it's supposed to be so tight, but it does move. It takes a little bit of leverage to move it. I tried tightening the spreader down more excessively to push out harder. I backed one of them off, pushed out harder, tried torquing it down. Then I tried it without using the spreader and torquing it down, and it was the same either way. The shaft is a little difficult to turn, but we'll see what happens. It does turn, so I don't think it's going to chew itself up, but I'll just be prepared to deal with it if it does. We'll see what happens. Also measured in between the holes, and then found the center of the shaft, put a little mark on it, and measured just right on top of the shaft when it's level, and got the same measurement. And I can also see the threads, and the threads are equal, so I think I've got the shaft in the center, so I think we're good to go. Alright, so the next step is to install the inner shaft to the lower control arm, and it happens a little bit different than the upper control arm. You can't torque down one of the bushings in one side and then manipulate the shaft in place, because the bushing sticks out too far into the inner space on the control arm. So what you have to do is you have to just start the bushing and manipulate the shaft in place, get the shaft started, and before you try tightening anything up, go ahead and get the other bushing started. And there's no mention of using a spreader tool on the lower control arm, but you have to apply some inward pressure on the bushing in order for these threads to start into the threads in the control arm. Once you get both sides started and they're simultaneously threading onto the shaft, you can twist the shaft and use it to draw the bushing in as you're tightening the bushing, if that makes sense. But you don't have a lot of room to get the shaft in, especially once you get the rubber boots on. When you go to put it in, you see how far off I'm half an inch off. I've got to compress the boots in order to get the shaft over here into the hole that the bushing rides in. Alright, so got the shaft in place. Didn't want to videotape it. Took a little bit of grunting and groaning. You can see the bushing is compressed and packed into the hole where the bushing goes. So now it moves around in here freely. Now I'll just start the bushing onto the shaft itself and kind of do both sides. And that way I'm using the shaft to make sure that the bushings are going in squarely, but and I'll just tighten them by hand until they start to snug up. All right, and then I'm going to back them off a little bit, and then you just got to be sure that you're not cross-threading the bushing into the control arm. And you've also got to apply some inward pressure on that bushing to get the threads to bite into the control arm threads. So now I'm going to go outside and continue to torque these down, and I'm going to torque them down a little bit on each side and go back and forth, and also make sure that the shaft continues to move freely and that you're not binding it up. So like I said, just make sure the shaft continues to move freely, and it's a little difficult to move, and slowly tighten one bushing a little, and on the inside right here you'll see the bushing start to come through a little bit, and then go over to the other side. Tighten it. Make sure everything still moves. And if it gets tight, if the shaft gets tight, you may have to back one of the bushings off a little bit and maybe rotate the shaft 360 degrees just to make sure it stays loose. But anyway, alternate back and forth between the bushings as you tighten them down. All right, and here we go. So they're torqued down, and you can see that the shaft moves. Takes a little bit of leverage to get it to move. but it does move. Would be nicer if it moved a little easier, but I'm not going to worry about it at this point. And now this shaft, before I install it into the car, this shaft needs to be centered between these two surfaces here. So what I'll do is I'll measure, find the center, and then I'll just use tape measure and make sure I'm centered. And I can rotate the shaft 360 degrees in either direction to get the shaft to move forward and back. And of course, you want it to be in the center, so that's your 0 point for the front end alignment. I don't think this is not a popular adjusting point for your front end alignment, but it can be done if your caster's way off. You may have to support the arm, unbolt this mounting shaft and rotate it forward or back, which will drastically change your caster. And so that's it for now.